Perkin from Lake 88.1 Radio, and today we've got lots of great questions from you folks. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Some of the rules, first of all, rules of courtesy. All participants are asked to exercise courtesy to each other and to all those present, and this is also a no-tolerance policy for personal attacks against any individual or the use of foul language at any time. It's an opportunity for all those present here tonight to discuss the issues that matter most within our local community, and persons who ignore these rules, we're talking about the audience as well as our participants, will be removed. Please, if you could, also turn off your cell phones and set your pagers to vibrate tonight, and please note the fire exits that we have here just in case. We have an order of the evening that I'll let you know about right now. Each candidate will have an opening address that will be 2 minutes in length. The order in which the candidates will be speaking is determined alphabetically, and this will be followed then by a question period that will last about 90 minutes or so to take us almost up to 9 o'clock. Each candidate will have about 2 minutes to present closing remarks after the question period, and the order for the speakers in that particular instance will be reversed from the opening remarks. We've got our timekeeper here as well. Clay Spiro is back again, and Clay is going to be the person with the bell. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for their opening and their closing addresses. For a response to each question, candidates will be allowed 2 minutes, up to 2 minutes. You don't have to fill the 2 minutes if you don't want to, but it's up to 2 minutes. And the bell will sound in each instant to give you a 30-second warning. So the bell is there, okay? Clay will perfect that as we go through the night. There you go. It's the light touch. So we are going to move now into the opening remarks. And as we mentioned before, Jamie mentioned that Matthew Barton from the People's Party of Canada is not available for tonight. So we'll go on to the next one alphabetically, and that would be Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party, starting our 2-minute remarks to start. Kaylee?
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. Thank you to Jamie and the Chamber of Commerce for welcoming us all here and taking the time to organize the event, and to everyone else who's contributed in any way. My name is Kaylee Kennedy, and I am your Liberal candidate here in Lanark-Frontenac-Kingston. I'm a proud graduate of Smith Falls District Collegiate Institute and have an honors bachelor's degree in public relations and a master's degree in political management. Growing up, I danced, played goalie in local rinks in Smith Falls and Carleton Place, and also was involved in community theater, both with Mississippi Muds in Carleton Place and the Smith Falls Community Theater, and a member of the Carleton Place Town Singers for some time. My parents are railroaders, and my family has lived in Lanark County for about 200 years. When I began my studies at Carleton University, I started working for a member of Parliament from Toronto, and I had the opportunity to travel back to her constituency with her and see the level of service she was providing to the people who lived there. And I was really inspired by how hardworking she was, and I feel like we need someone who's back in the community, 100% committed to their constituents, so I decided to put my name forward to serve the community that I grew up in. I have work experience in economic development and tourism, education, and human rights. And I'm also an entrepreneur, so I understand what it takes to create good, well-paying jobs in the riding and to help entrepreneurs succeed and grow. The Liberal government raised taxes on the wealthiest 1% in order to cut them for 9 million middle-class Canadians. They put a price on pollution, which will lead to a healthier environment and put more money back in the pockets of Canadian families. And they helped develop and bring into law historic pay equity legislation that will ensure that women and men in federally regulated workplaces are paid for equal work of equal value. I look forward to your questions tonight. I want to be part of that Liberal government, and I would really be honored to serve you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party. We move on now to Stephen Kotza, who is with the Green Party. Stephen?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jamie, and the Chamber of Commerce for organizing this. It's really important to have these kinds of events to help us as candidates reach out and connect with people in this community. I've been in Carleton Place a number of times, but it's hard to meet everybody. And even here, this is just a sprinkling of the town of Carleton Place. But I very much appreciate you all taking the time to come out tonight. So thank you. I'll just spend a few minutes telling you about myself because I'm probably not very well known to you. I've lived in Lanark County for 35 years, where I raised my family with my wife, Rosemary. I've run a successful accounting business there for the last 20 plus years. I've been very active in my community as a volunteer consistently over my time here, and I'm currently the treasurer of the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust. So I guess there are two main issues for me in terms of why I've decided to step forward and run in this election. The first is that I feel, along with many people that I speak with, a frustration in how we're doing politics, that the politics are overly divisive, competitive, partisan, and we need to bring some change to how we do politics. And I believe the Green Party is the best vehicle to carry that forward. The second issue has to do with climate change, and I feel that this is the defining issue of this election. We are hearing it more through the media. It's being more talked about, and I believe that the Green Party has the best plan to address this issue while maintaining a strong economy. And also supporting social programs. So I look forward to your questions and sharing more about the Green Party, what we have to offer. My name is Stephen Kotze again. Thank you very much for being here.
All right, Stephen Kotze of the Green Party. We move on now to Scott Reed from the Conservative Party.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Scott Reed. I'm the sitting member of Parliament, now going into my 19th year as an MP. It has been a real honor and a real privilege to represent, I think it's probably a privilege to represent any riding, but it has been a particularly great privilege to represent this place that is so wonderful and that I love so much. My wife and I used to live in Carleton Place. My wife and I now live in Perth, and it really is the most wonderful part of the world to be in, being here. I think this is the defining theme of this election from the perspective of myself and of my party. This is the affordability election. There are three parties that have, I think, ultimately financially very difficult to sustain and very expensive programs. In particular, the Liberal platform would lead to $90 billion in new spending and a good deal of uncosted new spending. I think that would put the country in a great deal of financial difficulty in the long run, particularly if we face a recession. But before I get into that, and I hope I'm able to answer questions on that subject, I did want to talk a little bit about my own record and the things that I'm doing locally that are important to me, and I think hopefully to you too. I've put, as many of you will know over the years, many defibrillators into rural community centers, into senior centers, police cars within the two independent police forces in this area, Smith Falls and Perth. Additionally, something that's very important that I think requires constant work in the future is the expansion of rural broadband. Our service levels are frankly expensive and unacceptable in rural areas, and it seems to me, after many years of watching this, we do not improve these things as much as we ought to. That's going to be a major focus for me in the upcoming 4 years. I look forward to answering questions and perhaps at the end to getting your vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Scott Reed for the Conservative Party. And also Satanka Schilling, who's with the New Democratic Party. Satanka?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's really important to everyone up at this table that you come out to these events and hear what we have to stand for. I think it's an important part of the democratic process, so thank you again, all of you, for being here. My name is Satanka Schilling. As Brian mentioned, I'm representing the New Democratic Party of Canada. And the reason that I chose to run in this election is because of the climate crisis and the overwhelming uncertainty that that puts on youth in terms of our future. We've seen in the last months, even in the last year since Greta Thunberg started her school strikes, that youth overwhelmingly believe that climate change is the #1 priority in terms of politics at the moment. It's very, very important for me because it it challenges our quality of life. It challenges our ability to see hope for the future, to create careers in the future. And most people my age, as far as I am aware, are really focused on how are we going to survive. The NDP stands for the people. I have come from a low-income household. I live in a rural riding. I've had to rely on using my bike for transportation, for not being able to count on food on the table. So I stand by the NDP and their commitments to you and their commitments to social policy and social justice. So thank you very much. I hope I get to touch on some of those topics for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Satenka. Satenka Schilling from the New Democratic Party. All right, after our opening remarks now, we're going to be moving on to questions. We've got a lot of them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Some are on the same subject, so we may be combining some. Again, I remind all of our folks here that you've got 2 minutes for that. The bell will be in action as well, and I will do my best to mix it up so that everybody gets to start and finish in different situations. I am going to start with Kaylee Kennedy for this. If anybody wants, before you stand up, for me to repeat the question, I'm more than happy to do that as well. Okay? First one, kind of a general one. When you decided to run in this election, what difference did you think you could make to improve the lives of people living in this riding? And I'll start with Kaylee Kennedy, if I could. And I'll ask each of the folks to stand for your, unless you want to sit. If you want to sit, because you've got some information there. I'll leave it to you, whether you stand or...
I'll probably sit.
That's fine.
So I ultimately decided to run because I want to make a difference in the lives of people here. I care about this community, having grown up just outside of Smiths Falls, and family in Franktown and Beckwith Township, and also in the Alma area. So I feel like the Liberal government has the best and the vision for the future, and it's also an affordable one. I think that by being present in the riding and listening to people and attending events, hearing what issues are important to them, and then taking that back to Ottawa is a really crucial factor. My commitment would be coming back when the House of Commons wraps up for the week, to be right here listening to people and doing the best possible job I can to represent them. Whether you agree with my policies or not, I'm committed to working with people in this riding of all different political stripes, because ultimately it's up to, it's our job to do a good job representing you.
All right, thank you. Stephen Katza.
Maybe I'll stand for this one, but I can see everybody. Well, I would have to say, I mean, we're all representing different parties. We all obviously believe that our party is presenting the best platform for you and for Canadians and for people in this riding. The Green Party has not had a stronger tradition of parliamentary experience, or it hasn't been around as long as the other parties, and I feel that the Green Party really does have a very strong platform. It is very credible, and part of my mission in running in this election is to try and get the message out about what the Green Party is standing for and running for. And I think that if you take the time to look at what we're saying, that you will find that there are many things that you should be able to relate to. I think our program really addresses many issues that affect everybody. Fundamentally, we want to ensure that we have strong social programs. We also want to ensure that we have a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we won't be able to afford good social programs. I think affordability is a big issue. I know Scott is talking about the Conservative Party's commitment to ensuring that we meet our financial targets. The Green Party as well has that interest. In fact, we are both saying that we will balance the budget in the same time frame. So I think that it's really important that we look at what all the parties have to say. We don't necessarily just go with what we've done for the last number of elections, but that we have an open mind. And I hope to be able to articulate and inform as much as I can throughout this election period about what the Green Party is and what we have to offer. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Stephen. You're more than welcome to clap or not. It all depends what you want to do. Scott Reed. Scott?
Trying to decide whether to stand or sit here. You know what I'm going to do? I think I'm actually going to stand because it's hard to hold the microphone in the right position, and I could hear part with my remarks before that I could hear myself getting fainter. Okay, so what would I like to be able to do in the next 4 years as your member of parliament? One thing I mentioned earlier was advocating on the issue of rural broadband. Look, if you're trying to run a business in a small town or from a farm, you need to be able to have adequate both upload and download. Download speeds are not great in the towns like Carleton Place and Miss Falls. They're terrible when you get a bit further out. Upload speeds are typically 10% of that, so that's a very significant issue. And the way in which we tend to focus federally, unfortunately, on trying to improve these, the issue of broadband service, internet service in rural areas, is to focus on building what's called more backbone. I think that's the wrong area to focus on. We should be trying to focus on more filling in of what we would call the cells in the rural areas as a way of ensuring that service is improved. So that's a wrong regulatory direction. It's not a sexy issue, but it's the kind of approach that I think could get things done. Focusing on the rural economy in general, value-added production, I think that's really important. And we are close to 2 large cities in this riding. Here we're close to Ottawa, Kingston in the south end of the riding. People come out from the cities to spend their weekends, to cottage, to go to community theater, to go to farmers markets. Trying to facilitate that and making it easier, I think, is very important. The issue of affordability is an important one. I think trying to keep our costs under control, and in particular, the costs associated with the carbon tax, what that's going to do to people who have to drive. They can't get out of driving because we live in a rural area, spread out, or from heating their houses with oil. So those are considerations. Finally, one thing I will do if re-elected is something I've done in the past, and that is to represent you on important issues by voting the way you think I should vote. That's what I did on the issue of cannabis legalization, assisted suicide, same-sex marriage, and so on. I would continue to do that for similar issues in the future.
All right, thank you, Scott. And finally, Satanka Schilling of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. I'll remain sitting just for the sake of your time tonight. The question was, what difference can I make for this riding? There's 3 points that I'd like to address for you on this question. Firstly, I'd like to support small farmers in the transition to sustainable and clean energy practices. The NDP has a plan in place for this that would in part include investments into new technologies. In part that would include providing funding for education for farmers on how to transition to sustainable practices. We would also invest money into young and new farmers because young farmers are going to make the biggest difference in this industry, and not that farmers don't care about the environment. They certainly do, and they certainly have a passion for it. But I think we're seeing that young farmers coming into the industry are willing to take the new steps and not fall into the traditional practices that we've been using for the last 100+ years. Secondly, the NDP has a very strong stance on healthcare. We would bring dental care, pharmacare to you residents here in Lanark-Frontenac and Kingston, and that is something that is a huge out-of-pocket expense, especially for young people and seniors who typically have a lower income and also have the most to spend on these costs. Thirdly, it's very important to me to represent Indigenous peoples in Parliament. We have a very strong culture of the Algonquin people here in Lanark-Frontenac-Kingston. This is their native territory, and the NDP is committed to giving Indigenous peoples a voice at the very top of the table for every major decision that impacts the environment. So those are my commitments to this riding, and I hope that those resonate with you. Thank you.
All right, Santanka Schillinger, the New Democratic Party. All right, we move on to another question, a very detailed question here from one of the folks that is attending tonight. So according to data from Statistics Canada, Canada's net debt as of March of 2019 was approximately $768 billion Canadian funds and rising. The question is, what is your party's total funded costed election promises, and what is the fully costed increase in the national debt that would put on, and what tax increases might we expect to pay for this? We're going to start with Stephen Kotza.
Kotza. As I said previously, the Green Party is committed to being fiscally responsible, and our targets for balancing the budget match the targets set by the Conservative Party. I think the primary difference between our parties in reaching that commitment is that we won't cut social programs. And I think that's really important. We will enhance social programs. And how do we pay for it? Well, we do have a fully costed program. The Green Party submitted our platform for a full costing to the Parliamentary Budget Office this election. And even though they have said that there are uncertainties, of course there are always uncertainties, we are committed to a strong economy, creating jobs, and ensuring that we are not only good stewards of our environment, but also good stewards of our purse strings. And I'm an accountant, that's what I do, and it's something that I will bring to the position. How we will pay for our election issues is we will be looking at increasing corporate tax rates. We will be looking at a tax on financial transactions. We'll be looking at closing certain loopholes that enable particularly larger corporations to get away with not paying their fair share, taxing offshore corporations, or trying to close loopholes for people who are sending their money outside of the country. We want to keep jobs here in Canada. We want to build a strong economy, and I think we have a good plan to do it. Thank you.
All right. Stephen Kotza. Okay. Scott Reid.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer of Canada in this election, this is a first-time thing, the Parliamentary Budget Officer is in a position to cost the spending proposals and also the revenues generated by taxing proposals by the different parties. And you can find all of these cost estimates on the Parliamentary Budget Officer's website. I've just got one here as an example. This is what they look like. You can print them out. So this one, by way of example, is the cost estimate for enhanced registered education savings plans. That's one of the Conservative government or Conservative Party proposals. And there's a second page which provides the cost for each of the next 10 years based upon the proposal as sent to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. There's a whole suite of these things, and he continues to post these as promises are made by a party in order to allow us to see what those costs would be. So the question was about the total package, and in the case of, I think it's true of all the parties, there are still policies being released which have implications either for revenues generated by taxes or for costs generated by new programs. Hence, I can't give you a firm total for any of the parties. What I can tell you is that each of the proposals put out by the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Greens have been costed. The Liberals, however, have taken the stand that they are only submitting certain costs to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and they're leaving some out. So, for example, we literally have no idea of the costs of their proposed pharmacare plan. We can guess from what the PBO has said with regard to the Green Party's pharmacare policy and see whether that might be the same thing, but it means that you really can't rely on the costs proposed by the Liberals, and that is a very significant problem.
All right, thank you, Scott. Now, Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So I can't, as Scott mentioned, give you an exact total. I can, however, tell you that the NDP is not willing to sacrifice any of our social programming that benefits Canadians, particularly lower income Canadians, for the sake of balancing the budget. That being said, where is the money going to come from for all of these programs that we are promising to you? I'll tell you exactly where it's going to come from. It's going to come from the richest of the rich who are not paying their fair share. We'll be closing the tax loopholes for CEOs and large corporations, ending fossil fuel subsidies, implementing an additional 2% tax increase to those making over $210,000 a year, as well as a flat 1% wealth tax for those making over $20 million a year. So as we can see, there's a great range of incomes in this country, and we believe that those who are benefiting the most from our current system should be paying their fair share towards the programs of those that are working the hardest at the bottom of the barrel. That being said, we are also planning to introduce a few new taxes, including a 50% foreign home buyers tax, which will bring in millions of dollars a year as well. And we are planning to increase the amount of investment profits subject to capital gains up to 75%, which was the rate that it was at in the year 2000. So as we can see through the past Conservative and Liberal governments, they have lowered that so that in itself is going to bring in about $3 billion a year in revenue that we can put towards social programs. So it is the NDP's plan to be fiscally responsible. As Scott mentioned, the NDP has submitted our plan to the Parliamentary Budget Officer to be reviewed, and that is fully taken care of. We're not planning to fritter away your money. We're just planning to redistribute where it's going. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Satanka. And finally, from the Liberal Party, Kaylee Kennedy.
What we've done is we have raised taxes on the wealthiest 1% so that we can give tax breaks to middle-class Canadians, millions of middle-class Canadians, so it benefits those who need it most. Our record is that we have the best debt-to-GDP ratio. We have created over 1 million new jobs since elected in 2015. 900,000 people have been lifted out of poverty, 300,000 of those being children. And we've been investing where investments are needed. There are other types of deficits as well. Infrastructure deficits, for example. We can't cut our way to prosperity. We need to fix the things in our communities like bridges in Carleton Place, like roads in Charlotte Lake. We need to be making those investments so that people can live in their communities and also be giving money to families through things like the Canada Child Benefit so that children have the best possible start in life. So we've seen that our plan is working, and the Liberal government is going to continue investing in Canadians and avoid acting in a way like the Ontario Progressive Conservatives have and the Harper Conservatives did for the decade prior to our government. Trying to cut their way to prosperity just doesn't happen.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. We move on to a different question now. A Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report found that someone working full-time at minimum wage could only afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in 3% of Canadian neighborhoods, despite declining poverty rates and strong job creation. What will your party do to alleviate the affordable housing crisis that our communities are now facing? And we'll start this time around with Scott Reid from the Conservative Party. Scott?
Well, that deals with, the preamble to the question deals with the very specific situation of low-income people and their housing. But the broad issue of housing affordability is a very real one for people who are also at the higher income levels, particularly in our cities. So less relevant here, but the issue of the problems imposed by the mortgage stress test that was imposed in 2017 and the effect that's had on people's ability, in particular, to renew their mortgages is very problematic. So one thing that we would like to do is to terminate the stress test for people who are renewing their mortgages. It's one thing to have it for people with their first mortgage, entirely different when you're renewing your mortgage, and as well to make some adjustments to make housing more affordable in our big cities for people who are becoming homeowners for the very first time. I recognize that's not quite the same question that's being asked about people who are earning minimum wage. That is a different problem that I think is overcome by trying to make their lives more affordable. Housing is one of the expenses they face. They face other expenses, including heating that house. And if the price of heating fuel is driven up, then it's going to be that much harder to be able to cover all the costs they have. And I think, therefore, that focusing on trying to reduce these costs, bring them under control, by, for example, getting rid of the carbon tax, to which we are committed, would be a good way of helping make housing more affordable.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
Affordable housing is something that is very close to my heart. I've grown up in low-income household for my whole life. I've gone through periods of my life where I faced homelessness. I currently struggle to pay my rent, working at a low minimum wage job, and I work full time. And as Brian mentioned, I do rent a 2-bedroom apartment, so I'm not living lavishly at all. And I seriously sympathize with people who struggle to meet that basic need. The NDP is committing to building 500,000 units of affordable housing. That includes subsidized housing, co-op housing, and social housing as well. And 50% of those units will to be built in the first term in office, so in the first 4 years. The NDP is also committed to offering subsidies to those who can't afford their rent. Jagmeet Singh actually announced just last week that he would offer up to $5,000 in reimbursements for rent costs for low-income households. So that's something that's desperately needed and will help a lot of people. In addition to that, the NDP is planning to increase first-time mortgages to a period of 30 years so that it makes it easier for younger people to buy homes. And as I mentioned earlier, the foreign buyers tax that we are planning to introduce is a measure that would actually help to combat the rising housing prices, because we would be sort of deterring those from buying homes in Canada that they're not going to be living in. So thank you for the question.
All right, thank you very much. And Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
I am going to address the first part of the question. Though minimum wage is a provincial issue, it's a clear demonstration of what happens when Conservative governments come into power. The Liberal Party of Ontario was planning on raising the minimum wage, and that was halted when Doug Ford's Conservatives came into power. I think our federal government also needs to take steps to make sure that housing is affordable for everyone. We are taking initiatives to lift people out of poverty. One of those being the Canada Workers Benefit. Another for people with children is the Canada Child Benefit. And we've seen that those programs are working. Also, our national housing strategy. It's a blueprint for reducing chronic homelessness by 50% and will remove more than 530 households out of housing need. And for those who are looking into purchasing a home, we are introducing the first-time home buyer incentive, which will give people up to 10% off the purchase price of their first home.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. And Stephen Kotza from the Green Party.
The Green Party has a comprehensive program to address this issue. I certainly know that it is something that is faced by many people. I know, for example, in Perth, the cost of housing is comparable to the cost of housing in Kingston, and it's very hard for people to find affordable housing. First off, the Green Party supports establishment of a federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Secondly, we support the creation of a national guaranteed livable income program that would ensure that everyone has a basic income on which to survive and meet their expenses. There are specific points as well in the program that deal with housing. For example, appointing a minister of housing to strengthen the national housing strategy, increasing the National Housing Co-Investment Fund by $750 million for new builds, and the Canada Housing Benefit by $750 million for rent assistance for 125,000 households. We would also create a Canada co-op housing strategy that would update the mechanisms for financing co-op housing. So you see, there are many issues here. Fundamentally, housing is a poverty issue, and the Green Party is committed to eradicating poverty in this country. And it has, as I've articulated, many points in its platform that will help us achieve that objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, we move on to another question. By the way, there are single seats here and out there, so anybody at the back is more than welcome to come and take some of the seats there. Another question now. Last election, there was a great deal of discussion on moving Canada's electoral system away from the current first-past-the-post format to one that would use proportional representation. Do you think that voters' interests are better represented under proportional representation, or would it concentrate too much power in the hands of Canada's political parties? And this time around, we're going to be started with Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party. Satanka?
That's a great question. Personally, I believe that the current election system, first past the post, is outdated and does not work, and it does not accurately represent Canadians. In terms of putting too much power in the hands of the parties, the NDP is promising electoral reform, starting with a referendum to make sure that that is what Canadians want. Under the previous promises from the Liberal government, they did have some sort of a survey, but I feel that it wasn't completed by most of Canadians, and the referendum would be mailed to every single voting citizen so that we can all have a voice on the matter. In terms of moving away from first past the post, the NDP would be moving to a mixed member proportional representation system, and that would first be proceeded with a committee to make sure that we figure out how exactly that's going to look and how it's going to work, but that would ensure that we have both party representation and local representation. So we're not going to be sacrificing your local voice at the national level by moving to a system that more accurately represents the needs and wants of Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Satanka. And we'll move on to Kayleigh Kennedy of the Liberal Party.
Thank you. Over the past term, our government did proceed with unprecedented consultation with Canadians. Ultimately, major reforms of this nature have to have a consensus across the country, and what our government found is that consensus was not present. We remain committed, to continuing to improve the electoral system, and have done that in other ways by repealing undemocratic elements of the previous government's Fair Elections Act. And we will continue to move forward with different ways to strengthen our democracy. I think that a referendum, we've seen in areas of Europe that doesn't always result in the best outcome, in the best interest for many people. So I don't think that's the route we want to take.
All right, thank you, Kayleigh. And next up, Stephen Kotza from the Green Party.
I'm sure Scott will have poignant words on this subject because he's the expert on this question, and he was co-chair of the commission that was set up by the Liberal government. But unfortunately, 4 years ago, we were promised that that was going to be the last first-past-the-post election. And I think what is clear is that the current system really benefits primarily the two major parties in this country. And it doesn't foster a good system of government, and it's not representative. I believe that we do have differences of opinion, and we're not going to all agree on everything. And those differences of opinion should be reasonably represented in our parliament. Unfortunately, the current system allows for 30% to 40% of electors to elect a majority government that have 100% of the power, and I don't believe that that is democratic. Certainly, the Green Party strongly supports a movement towards some form of proportional representation. Work has been done on this. I think that Scott will attest that through his consultations across the country that there was a strong commitment on the part of Canadians to move to this system. But unfortunately, our present government saw fit to ignore that. I think it's a shame, and I think that we need something better. We are only one of 3 democracies around the world where we still have this outdated system, and I would hope that we can now move to making changes, and I think by helping to elect Green MPs, we will be well positioned to fight for those changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Scott Reid of the Conservative Party.
Maybe I'll try answering the second part of the question first, which was, would proportional representation give too much power to the parties over individual MPs? That's a legitimate concern. Some forms of proportional representation, list systems in which the list is compiled by the party, result in those people who are at the top of the list for each party being guaranteed election, those who are at the bottom being guaranteed they will not get elected, and those in between only getting elected if the party does very well. And so party bosses get to control who gets on what part of the list, and you can guess the result is more control over individual MPs by the party, less attachment by the MP to the actual concerns of people. So that kind of closed list system, in my view, should be avoided. If you create what's known as an open list system, you can get around this to some degree by having internal party elections determining who goes into what position. And as well, under some PR systems, you have individual MPs representing typically a larger riding than this one geographically for about half the membership. So that can be done. I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened in 2015. In 2015, Justin Trudeau said, and I remember the exact words, he said, "This election will be the last election under first past the post." That was an ironclad commitment, and it was made, according to my NDP colleague Nathan Cullen, it was made as a way of attracting New Democrat votes in British Columbia. Nathan says it was very successful in that. But as it turned out, when the committee produced an all-party except the Liberals, consensus saying that we support a referendum on proportional representation versus the status quo, and eliminated preferential ballot, which was Justin Trudeau's actual target. Preferential causes you to rank candidates. It favors the centrist party. Once we presented him with that clear alternative, Justin Trudeau announced, "I don't support this. I never supported it. PR leads to extremists getting into power." That is simply not so. And a referendum, like the NDP suggests, is the right way to go.
All right, thank you, Scott. We move on now to another question regarding cannabis production. Some of the legislation around the guidelines for outdoor grow ops seems to be lacking. What will your government do to clarify these guidelines and move to regulate production more effectively and safely in municipalities? We'll start with Kayleigh Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
Thank you for your question. I have heard this concern from people, and I have been communicating with the party to see what we will do. But I commit to you that I will, if elected, certainly work on that. I know that cannabis is a really important industry here in Lanark County. In particular, Smith Falls is home to canopy growth. And because our Liberal government did legalize and strictly regulate marijuana, it resulted in thousands of jobs for the community. And that was much needed because Smith Falls was facing a period of high unemployment for quite some time with the loss of Hershey, Shorewood Packaging, the Rita Regional Center, Stanley Tools. And now I I think actually some employers might be finding it difficult to find employees because tweed is so attractive to people. So I think cannabis really is a positive success story from the Liberal government. I think there is a lot more potential right here in Lanark County for that industry, and I definitely think we do need to look into the outdoor growing aspect of it as well, because it's important that people in their communities aren't negatively impacted by outdoor growing, by security concerns, or also potentially the smell of what's growing outside. So I will leave it at that, but definitely committed to addressing that issue should I be elected.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. Stephen Katza for the Green Party.
So I think we certainly have seen the benefits of cannabis legalization. However, the system isn't working as well as it should or could be working. Some measures that the Green Party would undertake to help make this work better is, as Kaylee suggested, although I don't think this is happening at the moment, allowing outdoor growth operations that aren't so intensive in terms of the use of water and electricity. Unfortunately, only conservative and liberal governments can make sure that we lose money growing cannabis. I'm not sure how that's possible, but but having said that, I think there are some specific measures that the Green Party would propose, which include removing the sales tax on medicinal products, not just cannabis, but any other medicinal products. Eliminating requirements for excessive plastic packaging on legal cannabis. As I said, allowing outdoor production. I think that's some of the measures that we would follow. But like I said, I think we can do a better job of managing this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Of the Green Party, Stephen Katza. Scott Reed of the Conservative Party.
Well, the specific question that was asked, I think relates to a particular circumstance that's happening here in Beckwith, where there's someone who would like to produce cannabis on his outdoor property, too close for comfort from the perspective of some of the neighbors along one or perhaps two of the property lines. So that's very specifically a zoning issue, which must be dealt with municipally. I think the thing we could do at the federal level to deal with this kind of circumstance is to try and make adjustments to a template for what is considered a permissible property on which to license a larger scale production facility. That is, production not just for personal use. There are a number of other cases I've heard of from across the country where there's indoor production facilities with inadequate ventilation, resulting in the unpleasant skunky smell of cannabis growing for people who live near the production facility. I haven't heard that complained about Smiths Falls, but it definitely is something that can arise, and it seems to me that appropriate regulations can deal with this to some degree through the licensing system. I do think we have another issue, though, which is we've got hundreds of pages of regulations. I actually got my assistant to print them out, and it's a binder like this of regulations on cannabis production, security, marketing, and so on. And it's, while I appreciate the intention of making sure that we roll this out in an efficient manner and a manner that's secure and safe, I think that we have created a highly bureaucratic system which will make it difficult for our cannabis industry to compete and potentially to export as the countries become markets for legal medicinal and recreational cannabis. This is an enormously important issue for the local area, given the fact that the largest legal cannabis operation in the world, manufacturing in the world, is right here in Smiths Falls. So very important to be focused on the details of making this work.
Thank you, Scott, from the Conservative Party. Now Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So as Scott rightly said, the question was on legislation on outdoor grow ops. As far as that is concerned, that is a jurisdiction provincially. Each province has the right to set up their laws in terms of how cannabis can or cannot be grown, either on your property or in your home. So that's not something that the NDP federally has a specific standing on. That being said, there is a huge amount of waste in the current system that we have, where we have to purchase, people have to purchase it online. You get excessive plastic bags, plastic bottles, paper waste, cardboard waste. And I think that if we were to move towards allowing people to run smaller grow-ups, potentially outdoors, that we'd see what we see with small-scale farming, where there's a lot less waste in packaging because the product is going more directly to consumer. So that's something that I do care about. However, I'm not sure the NDP's role in that federally, but I do appreciate the question. And I'd just like to make a note on the topic of cannabis. We've seen through the years, particularly racialized groups, unfairly jailed in terms of cannabis possession. It is the NDP's stance that we would expunge all records of possession for cannabis and allow those people to go free and live their lives freely. Thank you.
Sitanka Schilling, New Democratic. Thank you very much. We move on to another question now. And this particular person would like to know what plans each candidate has to end violence and abuse against women. And we'll start with Stephen Kotzer from the Green Party.
Well, I don't have time to consult with my policy manual here, but I can tell you that the Green Party is very clear in recognizing the right of women and supporting women. I know Scott is wearing his moose hide pin tonight, and I have one of those too, and I keep forgetting to wear it, but it is important. And what that says is that we men honor and make a pledge to protect our women and support them. So gender equity, eliminating violence against women to the extent that we can are certainly high up on the Greens' platform and policies. It is really a very hard thing to address. We don't have control over what goes on in people's homes, but I think by supporting women, continuing to support organizations like Interval House here in Carleton Place, by educating people, it's really important. You know, it's also related to mental health issues. It's related to poverty. You know, it's a complex situation that forced people to take out their frustrations on the people that they live with. And I think that it requires us to address this on a number of levels. As I've said, poverty is a big issue that the Green Party aims to address in a number of ways. So I think that's an excellent question. I wish I could give it a little bit more meat, but those are my feelings. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Stephen, from the Green Party. Next, Scott Reid from the Conservative Party.
Yeah, so I thought I'd actually stand up and show the moose hide. It's a 1-inch square of moose hide. This was an initiative started by some Indigenous people in British Columbia who felt that in their own community, men, in many cases, were not treating women properly. And the point of this is to say, you know, back in the day, a man who wanted to show that he was a real man went out and took care of hunting and providing for his family, taking care of them, protecting them, and hunting a moose, of course, was one of the things you could do. That's what a real man does. He doesn't go out and victimize the women around him and the children around him. So that's the point of that. It started off as an Indigenous initiative, and it's since spread on Parliament Hill, many MPs of all parties wear the moose hide square to make that point and show that solidarity. With regard to specific policies, I thought the best thing to do might be to just read off some of the things that the much maligned Stephen Harper government did with regard to violence against women. So I'm just reading here. We invested $100 million to help prevent, detect, and combat family violence and child abuse. We ended house arrest for offenses involving serious personal injury, including sexual assault and aggravated sexual assault. We enacted tougher penalties for those who import, produce, and traffic date rape drugs. We created the National Action Plan on Human Trafficking. We passed the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act to ensure protection for vulnerable women. That gives you a bit of an idea, and I would say pursuing the same kind of approach. That is to say, not being soft on offenders in this area, being tough as is appropriate on offenders is one of the best ways to protect women.
All right, thank you, Scott Reed. Sitanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So I believe it was earlier this year that the inquiry came out to the published paper on the murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, and that did find that this tragedy should be classified as a genocide. Now, I happen to agree with that. A genocide is the systematic wiping out of a culture or people's race, and we've seen that overwhelmingly so with residential schools, as well as out west particularly, the massive number of Indigenous women who go missing and murdered every year. So the NDP plans to implement the recommended steps in the inquiry that was formally published. In addition to that, we would promote domestic violence leave in the workplace so that women and children are able to safely get out of their homes and transition to a new safe living space without risk of losing their job. As well, we would make parental leave more flexible, and that's going to make life easier on women as well. We do have a national action plan to end gender-based violence, so that would be backed by funds to ensure that shelters and other programs have services that are available in all regions of the country. We're very lucky to have Lanark County Interval House here in this area, but there are many remote areas that are not so lucky as to have those services, and we plan to make sure that those are available all across the country. One other thing I'd like to mention is that women do tend to be trapped in homes due to their family commitments. We'd like to make this a little bit easier for women by making sure that all women have access to contraceptives and abortion across Canada so that they do not find themselves faced in that terrible situation. So, thank you.
Sitanka Schilling, thank you. And Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
Thank you so much for this very important question. Our government created a gender-based violence strategy, and we're going to continue building on that foundation with an additional $30 million investment to develop a national action plan. It's so important that everyone has reliable and timely access to protection and services no matter where they live, so we are investing in that. Something that I was really proud to see in our platform is that we're providing free legal aid to survivors of sexual assault and intimate partner violence to make sure that they have access to quality, affordable legal representation. So rather than just increasing penalties, we're actually making sure that women get the justice they deserve. We're also requiring that all judges in Canada undertake mandatory training on sexual assault law. We know that this was actually an initiative that was introduced by Rona Ambrose. However, the Conservatives in the Senate were playing political games and wanted to hold up legislation, and as a result of that, it did not get passed. We're having a discussion the other night at our debate in Charbet Lake about the partisanship of the Senate, and Andrew Scheer has said that he was going to go back to appointing partisan senators, whereas Justin Trudeau has implemented a system where those senators are nonpartisan. They are qualified, diverse people who deserve their seat in the Senate, and that's just one of many ways that our Liberal government will ensure that people get actual justice rather than appointing partisan political people in the Senate.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. Move on to another question now, and this is on climate change. It's become one of the top issues in this election and the campaign. The question is, what are you personally and what is your party prepared to do to address climate change in practical terms, including greenhouse gases, alternative fuels, electric vehicles, and solar energy. I'm going to leave the carbon tax section of that to a separate question, all right? So again, one of the top issues being climate change. What's your party prepared to do to address climate change, including in practical terms, greenhouse gas emissions, alternative fuels, electric vehicles, and solar energy? And we'll start with Scott Reid from the Conservative Party.
Well, there are several things to say. First of all, there is a very serious problem with greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide and methane emissions. Canada is a part of that, but it's important not to exaggerate how large an emitter we are, because the emissions side of the equation is not necessarily the most important side of the equation when we're thinking of what Canada can do. I'm well aware that emissions worldwide are a massive problem. They continue to rise, but Canada's proportion of worldwide emissions has gone down from about 2.5% to about 1.6, 1.7%. Our percentage is declining. Our actual overall emissions in Canada have been declining since the year 2000 and are lower than they were in 2000. Our population, of course, has gone up in that period, so per capita emissions are down substantially, and measured as a percentage, against GDP, the number of tons of carbon per $1 billion of gross domestic product, our emissions are down by more than 30% since the year 2000. So those are all positive trends. We want to accelerate those, of course. I think the best way of accelerating that is through working on technologies which can be of benefit both here and in other countries, of course. Canada's primary role, I think, though, is as a carbon sink. We may be small as an emitter. We are potentially a superpower as a carbon absorber. So obviously that means taking advantage of that means taking advantage of our extensive forests and also grasslands, which can absorb carbon through their root systems. There are many initiatives one could take. One thing that the Liberals have proposed is planting 2 billion trees over the next 10 years. Not necessarily a bad idea, although I'd like to hear where exactly those trees are going to be planted. I think that's pretty important, and I would encourage anybody, my government or any other, to speed up that timetable.
All right, Scott Reid, thank you. We move on now to Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So, as I mentioned earlier today, climate change is at the forefront of all of our minds in terms of politics right now. That is why the NDP and the Green Party both have such an extensive and comprehensible platform on this point. So it's going to be hard for me to go over everything, but I'm just going to read off of our commitments here and make sure you get a good idea of the broader picture of what we're actually planning to do, what actions we're planning to make, as opposed to just what targets we're trying to hit. So the NDP, a key component of our plan is requiring all large-scale buildings to retrofit in all sectors so that we meet energy demand, create jobs, and save people money. We also will improve the national building code so that by 2030, every new building that is built will be net zero energy already. So that's one of our goals as well. We are planning to invest in transit, both urban and rural transit. So that's something that can help as far as reducing the amount of vehicles on the road. And we are also planning to heavily invest in the transition to electric vehicles and helping Canadian auto companies with that transition so that they have that incentive to do so. We are also planning to establish the Canadian Climate Bank. So that would be money pooled specifically for climate change resources. We do commit to fulfilling Canada's G20 commitments to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and also bring in an environmental bill of rights, which would ensure that all communities across Canada for citizens and Indigenous peoples alike would have the right to clean water, clean land, and clean air. Alongside many of the other parties, we are planning to mostly all reach the same goals in terms of emissions, in terms of banning single-use plastics, but I think these points that I made right now are fairly unique to the NDP, and we promise to follow through on that for you.
Thank you, Satanka. Kayleigh Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
The Conservative candidate has asked us to speed up the timetable on acting on climate change, but under 10 years of the Harper Conservatives, there was nothing done to fight climate change. So our government has made progress over the past 4 years, and we will continue to do so. We have committed to putting a ban on single-use plastics. We've also committed to net zero emissions by 2050, one of those initiatives being by planting 2 billion trees. I'm not sure where specifically they're going, but it's going to be a plan to take carbon out of the atmosphere, which is much needed. We are giving incentives on electric vehicles, and to ensure that those benefits aren't just going to people who can afford brand new electric vehicles, we're also promising to give a rebate, a 10% rebate of up to $2,000 on used electric vehicles. And we're going to be investing in the infrastructure that's needed so that it's actually a practical solution, that that infrastructure will be available for people to charge those cars. We've made historic investments in public transit across the country. And we're also moving forward with a new Clean Power Fund, which will help support the electrification of Canadian industries. And we're also going to try and help transition northern, remote, and Indigenous communities away from using diesel fuels. Finally, we are helping retrofit 1.5 million homes to help Canadians make their homes more energy efficient. And that will be by giving them an interest-free loan of up to $40,000. We've had a comparison side by side of the Liberals' plan and the Conservatives' plan. The Conservatives' plan, you have to pay upfront, and that will not be realistic for people who have lower incomes. It's another Conservative policy that's going to benefit the people that can afford it already and who are already wealthy.
Thank you, Kaylee. And Stephen Kotze from the Green Party.
Well, I do believe that the Green Party's climate action plan is the strongest of all the parties, and it really targets getting us to where we need to be. Fossil fuels have served us very well. We've built our economy on fossil fuels, and we are, most of us, still pretty dependent on it. And I think rightfully, many Canadians, and I'm sure most of the people in this room, are concerned about how we make the transition. You don't want to end up not being able to afford the things that we kind of take for granted, to be able to drive our vehicles and so forth. That's why the Green Party is really putting an emphasis on a just transition to a clean and green economy. We want to ensure that Canadians are able to that we work with Canadians to ensure that this transition is smooth. We do know we have the benefit of having many technologies that are well proven, not only in Canada but around the world, that are cleaner and that work. And what's more, they ensure that the operating costs for a family, if we do work to make homes more energy efficient, that will mean a cost savings for you. It'll make it so that your heating costs are less. There is an upfront cost to that, but over time, it is something that is well worth our while. And these are the kinds of changes that we want to work with you to follow through, because we know that climate change is an issue. We have to work to cut back emissions, and we have to work to end subsidies for oil and gas, and to stop increasing production. I have more to say, but I'm out of time.
Thank you so much. Now, in sort of the second half of the discussion here, we now move on to a question: is a carbon tax the best way to pay for measures that you've outlined to address climate change in Canada, or are there other ways to pay for the improvements we need? We're going to start with Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
It's a great question. I think that the carbon tax is not the best way to tackle this problem. However, the NDP is planning to continue with the carbon tax and use the money that is taken from it to invest into clean energy. In addition, we're planning to make some exemptions with the carbon tax, so making sure that, for example, those working in the agricultural sector who have a lot of expenses, who produce a lot of carbon, and then are making investments into transitioning away from those practices, that they are not paying for that out of pocket and they're being reimbursed for those charges or purchases that they make that will ultimately benefit all Canadians. So that's something that we're planning to do as far as the carbon tax is concerned. As I mentioned earlier, there is a big problem with the distribution of wealth in Canada. We're planning to use the taxes that I mentioned earlier on the wealthiest to work on those the programs that I mentioned in terms of climate change. So the carbon tax is not the only answer. It's not the best answer. We're sticking with it for now and trying to make it work for us, but that's all I really can say about that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Statenka. We'll move on to Kaylee Kennedy now from the Liberal Party.
Our Liberal government implemented the price on pollution during our mandate. And this is because climate action simply can't wait. We need something that's going to help us protect our environment. And this method actually puts money back in families' pockets. So I'm sure many of you noticed on your income taxes, there's a box you check, and that's how you get your rebate, from, which is called the Climate Action Incentive. I know that, unfortunately, a number of Conservative politicians, I'm not saying Scott did this, but other Conservative politicians in the country did kind of mislead their constituents and failed to leave that out when informing their constituents about filing their income taxes. So that's pretty unfortunate. In terms of the price on pollution, it's not the only way, but it's one of the number of things that we're doing. And we're also taking in consideration the fact that there are rural communities that depend more on still driving vehicles to get where they need to go. And that's why we have given a 10% top up. And that applies to most of this riding. So we did get that. Another thing Scott did mention during the debate last night in Cogeco, I didn't have the opportunity to rebut, but I really did. He said a cap and trade system would be more effective. And that's actually what was in place in Ontario already. And then Doug Ford's Conservatives scrapped it. So we ended up doing a different system because the federal government decided we needed to step in, make sure we're protecting our environment. But I truly believe if the Conservatives weren't elected in Ontario, we would still have that cap and trade system today.
Thank you, Kaylee. Stephen Katza from the Green Party.
The Green Party is on record as supporting the carbon tax, but I want to qualify that because I think it's unfortunate that that is the one issue that the present government has is kind of its flagship in terms of climate action. Fundamentally, I think we cannot continue to open up new oil and gas development and increase production. The Green Plan calls for using the oil that we produce in Canada, working harder to refine the oil that we produce here and keep it here instead of exporting it to Saudi Arabia and China. We want to keep that oil here and use it for us. I think that's important. In terms of other issues, what is central to our program is to cancel subsidies to oil and gas, because I think that that is far more important than just taxing the carbon. Because as you know, imposing these taxes affects you as consumers. And I don't think that for myself that this particular way of taxing carbon is very effective. I think we need to invest the money that we gain from ending the subsidies, from imposing taxes on carbon. We need to invest that money into renewable energy and other forms of energy, retrofitting housing, as I said before. There are many better ways to do that. And dear, I'm out of time again, and they're going to shut off my mic. But hopefully I can come back to this at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Scott Reid from the Conservative Party.
Yeah, so retrofitting housing is, I think, one of, and providing people with some of the costs associated with retrofitting housing seems like a reasonable way of helping them to bring down their carbon emissions from heating their houses. And my party has a policy on that as well. With regard to the issue of trading emissions credits, I just have to respond to Kaylee's observation about Doug Ford. Anybody who thinks that I am a reflexive defender of every policy that Doug Ford takes hasn't read what I said in the Globe and Mail about his dispute with Randy Hillier. So I will just observe that tradable credits, carbon emissions credits, make a lot more economic sense than the carbon tax for a very simple reason. And the reason is this: the people who have the highest cost to change will be the ones who will buy the right to emit carbon from those who have the lowest cost to change. And so essentially the low-hanging fruit will be dealt with. That is the most efficient way of doing things. The carbon tax is everybody will pay. You're paying based upon your use of carbon, and some people will have a very high cost to change. Some people who live in rural areas, people who have long commutes, people who have an old furnace but can't afford to change it. The point of the carbon tax is to make it so painful to heat your house that way or to drive that you will simply find some way of doing it, even if you have to go into debt. Sure, we get back on our income tax some of that money. It does not come back to the same people. It comes back in different amounts to different people, and therefore imposes costs on some people and imposes, or maybe grants, benefits to others. That's just inherently unfair as well as inefficient. Finally, 92% of the tax, carbon tax, paid by individuals, only 8% by corporations. And for example, the LNG plant in Kitimat, British Columbia was given $1 billion worth of carbon tax exemptions. How is that fair?
All right, Scott Reid, thank you. We move on now to another question. With so many of our local residents struggling to pay for essentials like prescription drugs and healthcare needs, what role do you see your party playing in defraying the cost of drugs and providing more support for those without adequate health insurance? Can you briefly explain your party's position on universal health care and speak to how that could also be funded? We're going to start this time around by Kaylee Kennedy of the Liberal Party. Kaylee?
Thank you for your question. We are moving forward on implementing national pharmacare. I think that's an important step for the government to take because it's important that everyone has the medication that they need to survive and shouldn't have to choose between taking your medication and putting food on the table or paying for your kids' extracurricular activities. So that is an important initiative. I'm going to take the remainder of my time for the question. Just kind of to point out something, a general statement that I might not have time for later. The Conservative candidate says he may not agree with Doug Ford, but I'd like to know where the party as a whole stands. Scott was the only Conservative candidate that voted in favor of cannabis legalization. And as I was talking about the positive impacts of that, also in terms of the medical marijuana side as well, if we had an Andrew Scheer government, we might not still have that industry to support our community. And while I respect Scott voting against his party on that one particular issue, every other Conservative candidate voted against it and voted against things like the Canada Child Benefit that really help Canadian families. So I think that we need to keep that in mind as we have discussions this evening.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. Stephen Katsa of the Green Party.
I guess I'll have to try and get through my answers more quickly. we as a Green Party are firmly in support of a strong healthcare system. I think all of us have had someone in our families or someone close to us that have depended on the system. We are seeing certain trends or certain desires on the part of some parties, and I think particularly the Conservative Party, not maybe as much federally as provincially, to cut back on some of these core social programs. And I think, it's something that I recognize that healthcare as an issue is fundamentally a provincial issue. But as we do have a Health Act in Canada that does ensure that we have universal health care, and I think that is something that we all hold dear and that I would want to ensure remains strong. The Green Party does have a pharmacare program where we would support a national pharmacare program where people would have their drugs covered. This is the single biggest cost in our platform, but it will generate savings over time as we're able to access bulk purchases of drugs, but it is very much an affordability issue for many people. We also support increasing health care to include dental care for lower income Canadians and seniors. And I think these are two very important issues that concern all of us and that we want to put forward and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Scott Reid of the Conservative Party.
The cornerstone of our healthcare policy is something that we call the Health and Social Program Guarantee. And this is, I'll just read much of what our platform says. This is a commitment to maintain and increase the Canada Health Transfer, or CHT, and the Canada Social Transfer, CST, by at least 3% a year as currently mandated in legislation. In 2019-2020, the two transfers are providing $55 billion to provinces and territories. So $55 billion is the baseline, going up by 3%, which of course is above the inflation rate for the life of the next government or the next parliament. I'll just say something else. I wanted to throw something else in, another policy we are introducing. In an attempt to reduce wait times for potentially life-saving scans, we're investing $1.5 billion to replace and add new medical imaging equipment. So PET scans, MRI scans, CT equipment. The issue of pharmacare, I just want to deal with this. The New Democrats and the Green Party both have pharmacare plans which have been costed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. And they're not cheap, but some people may feel that it is worth the money. We'll be talking in the neighborhood of $20 billion per annum to provide pharmacare. The Liberals are also promising pharmacare, but they have provided no costs for it, and you have to add those costs on top of the $90 billion in anticipated deficits they're going to have. I have no idea how we could sustain that much spending, particularly if you have a recession and government costs go up while revenues go down. That could create a financial disaster. I think they should make some hard choices and actually tell us which policies they're going to be able to put in place.
Thank you, Scott. And Satenka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So, as Scott rightly pointed out, all three of the parties to his left are promising pharmacare in the upcoming election. That being said, I will self-servingly tell you that the NDP was the first party to put forward this commitment and have it in their platform. The NDP has been championing for Medicare since its very first inception, since Tommy Douglas, and we still strongly believe in that. In addition to pharmacare, we will be offering dental services, eye services, and hearing services, which are very much needed and are not available currently. We're also planning to make serious other investments into the healthcare system. We'd like to invest in training and retaining new doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals, especially in rural areas like Lanark-Frontenac and Kingston. I myself found myself in the position earlier this summer where my family doctor closed her practice along with another in Perth, and 2,000 residents of the Perth area were immediately out of primary health care services. So that's a serious need in this area, and it's something that I take very much to heart, and it's something that the NDP is promising to fix for all Canadians. In addition to that, we have a number of other commitments, such as equal access to abortion across Canada. There's a lot more I can get into, but primarily our commitment to you is pharma, dental, eye, and hearing care for all Canadians, and that would be with no deductibles or co-payments or anything like that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Satanka. Another question now. Can you comment on the extent your party's platform focuses on reconciliation with our First Nations and your party's goals to improve the living conditions on reserves? We'll start this question with Stephen Kotze from the Green Party.
Maybe I'll stay seated for this one. The Green Party fundamentally believes in the right of Indigenous people to self-determination. We believe that we need to respect the treaties that we have signed with Indigenous people. We believe that we need to enter into true partnership with Indigenous leaders and communities that fundamentally is based on respect, where a true partnership means that we listen and that our discussion is informed by each other and we move forward together. It doesn't mean that we consult with Indigenous people and then do what we want. We have to recognize our history and the impacts that our history have had on Indigenous people, and we still find Indigenous communities that have boil water advisories, etc. This is unacceptable in this country, and we have to take immediate steps to ensure that people across the country have all equal access to the services that many of us take for granted. Indigenous people are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. The list goes on. We have to be serious about ensuring that we respect, that we work in partnership, that we defer to Indigenous leaders for doing the things that they need to do in their own communities. We also want to ensure that we commit to following through on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Scott Reid from the Conservative Party.
Thank you. The Stephen Harper government, Stephen Harper himself was the Prime Minister who gave the historic apology for the residential schools and the terrible legacy of the residential schools. We now know, as of, actually it was either today or perhaps yesterday, the number of deaths in the residential schools was approximately 4,000 over the period that they were in operation. Many of those through neglect, but frankly, some of them through what can only be seen as a deliberate policy of separating from their parents, knowing that they were at risk of a far higher risk of communicable disease, and particularly of tuberculosis. And you have to see some of the things that were said at the time to believe it. I was just reading a book called 21 Things You Might Not Know About the Indian Act, and in the front of it is a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Administrator for what was then Indian Affairs in around 1910, 1912, writing a letter in which he says, "We are aware of the fact that more children will die in this circumstance, but that is not a reason to stop us from dealing with the, as he put it, the final solution to Canada's Indian problem." I was so astonished to see this that I actually had my researcher go and look up to see, is this for real? This was actually said, and apparently it was. So there is a terrible legacy to deal with in that regard, and a terrible scarring. Also, the stolen generation of children, the 60s scoop of Indigenous people, in this case by provincial authorities. There's a tremendous amount of damage at the personal level, and we need to deal both with honoring the individuals and providing individual reconciliation or compensation for those who were damaged, and also with recognizing the historical legacy that we need to make right.
Thank you, Scott Reed. And Satenka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
I have a very personal relationship with this issue. I was born to an adopted Native man who went by the name A Lone Dancing Otter. I was raised going to powwows. I participated in the protests against the uranium mines on Native lands in this riding. I strongly believe that Indigenous peoples need a voice at the highest level of power, and that they should have an equal say on all matters in level playing field with the Canadian government. They were on this land first, and it is with deep respect that we acknowledge that and continue to live on this land. So that being said, the NDP will fully implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We will follow the calls to action following the report on the murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, and we will establish a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This is very important in honoring the memory of those who died in residential schools and were victims of the welfare system that disproportionately stole young Indigenous people away from their families. They have recommended to the federal government that reparations be paid to those who suffered from this tragedy. I'm not sure if the NDP has committed to offering those reparations, but it would be my commitment to the people of this riding and the Indigenous people of Canada to make sure that that is addressed and make sure that that is part of the NDP's priority in the next term. One last thing I'd like to mention is that in addition to Medicare and labor laws, fighting for the rights of Indigenous people was one of the three founding points of the NDP party, and we've been fighting for that since 1961. So I hope that I can continue to do that.
Satenka Schilling from the NDP. And Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
Continuing our path forward on reconciliation is incredibly important. Our government has been building a nation-to-nation relationship and has been taking action in critical areas as well. One of the accomplishments I'm most proud of from our Liberal government is that we have lifted 87 long-term drinking water advisories on reserves. I really fundamentally believe that everyone in Canada should have access to clean drinking water. Like, there's no question about that whatsoever. And our government is on track to lifting the remaining advisories by 2021. So we've done that work. There's definitely more work to do, but our government is taking action on it and getting things done. Our party is also taking action to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we're going to do that in the first year of our mandate. I attended a presentation with Perry Bellegarde in Ottawa. He was there speaking alongside Paul Martin, actually, and he was talking about the importance of Indigenous economic reconciliation as well. And some economic plans that we have are ensuring that Indigenous communities directly benefit from major resource projects in their territories by creating a new national benefits sharing framework. We're also going to be supporting Indigenous-led businesses, and we're moving forward with the target to have at least 5% of federal contracts awarded to businesses led by Indigenous peoples. So those are some of our priorities over the next 4 years of the Liberal government.
All right, thank you, Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party. Another question now. Jobs are usually an important topic for voters right across the country. What will your federal party do to bring meaningful jobs to Lanark County? And we start with Scott Reed of the Conservative Party.
Well, one thing that I would like to do is to work on trying to make the federal cannabis regulations as business friendly as possible. I've spoken on numerous occasions to the executives at Canopy Growth about what is needed to ensure that we can develop a business friendly environment for the numerous issues that exist as we try to develop this industry to allow us to develop a strong export market. So we face, for example, just all kinds of bureaucratic impediments to things such as trying to send genetic material from Canada to other countries in order to allow medical cannabis operations to be started in other countries, and numerous other similar regulations that would make an enormous difference to what is right now the largest private sector employer in the riding. So that's one thing that will be a personal priority. I mentioned the issue of rural connectivity. You know, it's very hard to have a home-based business. If your business faces connectivity issues, you can't participate easily in, for example, in video conference calls. If you're a farmer and you're trying to upload information regarding your GPS as you go through your fields with adjustables necessary to record soil conditions, if you can't upload the information, you can't use that equipment effectively. That's very problematic, so that would make a significant difference. There are other things too, but perhaps I will stop there with those two initiatives. I think that would be two very significant personal goals for myself.
All right, thank you, Scott Reed. Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So as I mentioned earlier in the night, one of my priorities is helping small farmers and small farms in the area to make the transition to clean energy and sustainable practices. One of the benefits to this is that it actually produces more, lowers costs, and creates more jobs than industrial farming. We have seen across Canada that industrial farms take about 98% of profits from the agriculture industry, and small farmers only take 2%. So in this area where farming is so important, there are so many farms that need help and need assistance in terms of combating flooding and things of that nature. The NDP is committed to investing money into small farms in the agricultural sector, which is really important in this riding. In addition to that, the NDP wants to move towards a fossil fuel-free future, and that would include producing 300,000 jobs in the green energy sector. Just across from my parents' home in Stanleyville, between Perth and Westport, there was a solar farm built just across the way, and that provided jobs to people in the area for almost a full year while that was being constructed. I'd also like to address the fact that the NDP would like to move towards free post-secondary education in Canada, all across Canada, and that's something that's going to allow young people or people who want to get into a new career to get that education to open themselves up to more job opportunities that they may not have been able to get into prior. So, thank you.
Satanka Schilling, thank you. We move on to Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
The broadband issue is also an issue that I see as a critical step in addressing the ability for entrepreneurs to succeed and grow. And our Liberal government has invested over $71 million through the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, specifically to build that infrastructure for Eastern Ontario alone. So we are investing in that. We see it as a priority. We know that it's a necessity in today's society, both for businesses, for students who are going to school and working for home. It's really critical in today's day and age. Some other steps that we are taking to help entrepreneurs succeed and grow include creating the Canada Entrepreneur Account, which is going to provide basically funding for new businesses to get off their feet. And we are going to also cut the swipe fee on HST and GST for credit transactions, and that will save businesses nearly $500 million a year in fees. In terms of jobs, you can see our record over the past 4 years. As I've mentioned a number of times, we have created 1 million jobs since elected. Canadians have been working hard, and through infrastructure investments, that creates jobs too. By investing in infrastructure, we are creating good middle-class jobs right here in our communities. So that's something that we'll continue to do, and we've seen the plan is working, and I hope that we get to continue working on that plan.
Thank you, Kaylee Kennedy. Stephen Consett from the Green Party.
Well, a number of the other candidates have taken some of the pages out of the Green Party platform too, not that they were ours first, but we share similar ideas and commitments. Certainly broadband and cell phone coverage in this area is a major issue affecting people, and I would want to support in the Green Party as well to make that more available and accessible to people in this riding. Satinka mentioned support for small farmers. Again, this is something right out of the Green Party platform as well, to ensure that we can help farmers stay on their farms. One of the things related to that is support for food processing. We've seen meat processing places closing in our riding, and it's harder for farmers to get their products processed. We want to support the return of and the increase in availability of food processing for local farmers and helping them get to market their products. Another thing that we want to look at is requiring federal institutions to access local food first, so that that provides a market for local farmers, as well as ensuring a higher quality of food for people in federal institutions. The Green Party Climate Action Plan, as I mentioned, calls for a number of measures. One being that hasn't been mentioned is innovation or work on retrofitting buildings. This would be a huge employment creator in this riding as we move to make buildings more energy efficient.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. And what will be our final question, another one from the floor. What is your party going to do to specifically support senior citizens with regards to housing, care, financial support, etc.? We'll start with Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party.
So I think, as you've heard a number of times tonight, the NDP is planning to implement a pharmacare and dental care program across Canada, and that is something that definitely affects seniors, particularly in our riding where we have low access to health services. There are a lot of expenses when you're on a fixed income and you don't have the ability to be flexible with that income to put money where you need it. So taking away some of those costs, prescription costs and healthcare costs, is going to be very beneficial. As I mentioned, the NDP is definitely committed to improving affordable housing in Canada, whether it's increasing the number of affordable housing units that we have, or providing rent subsidies up to the amount of $5,000 for those on fixed or low incomes who aren't able to make ends meet. So that's something that we're definitely working on. I think that more or less covers it. There's a lot that we have planned to do. We do plan to implement a ministry for seniors, so that there is somebody at the top level making sure that those issues are prioritized and addressed in Parliament. And I thank you very much for the question, and thank you for all of your questions tonight.
Satanka Schilling, NDP. We move on to Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party. Kaylee?
Our Liberal government did, in the last little bit of our mandate, create a minister that is responsible for seniors. The Honourable Philomena Tassi has been taking on that role, and I know that she was doing a number of town halls across the country to hear from seniors directly and what issues are important to them and how we can be of most help. Some things that we have done in the past are restoring the age of eligibility for old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. The Conservatives changed the age of eligibility from 65 to 67, and we restored it back to 65 so that people can start getting those benefits earlier. We're our future plan is that we're going to top that up by 10% once people hit the age of 75, so that they ensure that they have more benefits and can enjoy a secure and dignified retirement. Also, we're increasing widows' benefits through the CPP by 25%, so that if someone loses a spouse, then, and it's already hard enough as it is, they'll have that additional income to support them. That's what I will say for now on seniors.
Thank you, Kaylee Kennedy. Stephen Katza of the Green Party.
Once again, I find myself with more to say than I think I have time for. Fundamentally, we are looking at an aging population in Canada. In this riding, we have a high percentage of seniors. Clearly, there are many issues that affect the seniors in our community. The Green Party would institute a national senior strategy to address much of the issues faced by seniors. We want to ensure that the CPP program remains robust and that we continue, that we expand that over time. As mentioned, we're committed to a solid health care program and funding for pharmacare and dental care. We also feel strongly about transportation, and in this riding in particular, transportation is a challenge for many people living rurally. As I said before, I'm part of a task force in this county to see what can be done to bring, to look at transportation options here. And it's something that really affects the quality of life of people who are often isolated without ways to get places. And so the Green Party feels it really has a plan to invest in transportation. We've seen the loss of rail and bus services to remote communities across this country, and we would want to invest in reinstituting some of those options for people. Also, we are looking at innovative housing solutions that include co-housing options, and the list goes on. But I'm almost there myself, so this is something that I care deeply about. Thank you.
Stephen Katz of the Green Party. And Scott Reid of the Conservative Party.
Well, some of the issues that seniors face relate to anybody who is on a fixed income. In the case of many senior citizens, a fixed income that they can expect will never go up for the rest of their lives. And so some of the things that need to be thought about are the things that would affect someone on a fixed income. I've got some specific policies I'll address in a second that are senior specific. But look, if you have a fixed income and you have inflation, you face diminished ability to spend, to make that, spread that money around, and fiscally irresponsible government policies of just spending like crazy are ultimately dealt with by inflating the government's way out of its debt problems. That will be a very significant problem for seniors and anybody else who is relying upon their savings to get by, or on a fixed income to get by. So that's one thing to think about. The approach the government has taken of imposing the carbon tax, that will be very hard for anybody who is not in a position to retrofit their house at their own expense, get a new furnace. Likewise, problems that relate to the cost of driving under the Liberal carbon tax. So getting rid of that tax will be very significant for seniors. I note as well that the Conservative Party will be increasing the age credit by $1,000 per year per senior. Additionally, the universal tax cut which we're proposing will include senior earnings. That's a cut in the tax rate, the lowest tax rate from 15% to 13.75%. And as well, we're taking the GST off of home heating bills, which will definitely make an impact for anybody who is trying to heat their home, as many seniors are. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Scott Reid. And there you have it. We went through about 12 questions. I tried to group a couple of them together, but well over 30 coming from the folks here tonight and previously given to us. So we thank everyone for their questions. I wish we could get to them all, but we don't want to go until about midnight. We promised you about a 9 o'clock finish, so we're going to hold that to us. So let's finish up now. We have for all of our candidates to be tonight some closing remarks. Again, we remind all of our folks that these will be 2 minutes each, timed as we have been going before, and we're going to be going in the list now reverse alphabetically. So we'll be starting with Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party with your closing remarks.
Thank you again, Brian, for moderating this evening, and thank you again to everybody for being here and asking your questions. I think there were a great variety of questions. We got to touch on a lot of different topics that are meaningful to residents in this riding. I think that's really important. I'd like to take this time to go over my top priorities if I were to be elected to Parliament to represent you, as well as a couple of other things that I don't think got touched on during the evening tonight. In terms of my priorities, I sincerely care about the quality of life of seniors in this riding. I think that the NDP platform and commitments will greatly be able to improve that quality of life, as well as the pharmacare and dental care that will help seniors is also going to benefit anyone that isn't able to currently take care of themselves with the healthcare system that we have in place. Food insecurity and housing insecurity as well is something that is a top priority of mine, and I plan to make that known in office. Climate change is obviously a priority to everybody here tonight, and in addition to the steps that I make in my personal life to be very eco-conscious and move away from plastics and things of that nature, I think that we need to be making sure that corporations and fossil fuel companies are doing their part for all of the hardworking Canadians that are making small changes in their life where they're not actually going to see the biggest impact on a global scale. So I think that legislation needs to be made to control the subsidies given to fossil fuel companies. As I mentioned earlier, bringing a voice for Indigenous peoples to the table for major discussions is a great priority of mine. And I'd just like to mention that as far as engaging youth in politics, myself and Kaylee really strongly believe in this, and the NDP has a proposal to lower the voting age to age 16 so we can see all of those young people who are making their voice heard around the world able to make it known in government.
Satanka Schilling from the New Democratic Party. Thank you, Satanka. Scott Reed from the Conservative Party.
I think I'm going to stand up again. I'm getting stiff. I'm not, of course, as young as Kaylee or Satanka, and sitting in one position too long is not something I want to do. I wanted to start by just going through what the other candidates had said and point out one policy from each of the three parties that I happen to like. So I already mentioned in the case of the Liberals, I think the policy about planting 2 billion trees is a good idea. I do think it would be better if the timeline were moved up. A tree will not pull carbon into the atmosphere until it's planted, so it makes more sense to front-end load something like that. And I might encourage the Liberals to put more money into that and less into their proposed camping credit, to which they're giving a larger amount of money. But it is a good policy, right? The Green Party on cannabis, Stephen laid out some very detailed notes on what the Green Party was doing, and enough so that I made a note to myself to look them up and see if there's anything worthwhile that we could poach. I used to be in the Reform Party. It is the lot in life of parties that are starting out to get their ideas poached by others. So, but it's a good set of ideas. I thought very practical. The New Democrats on having a referendum on electoral reform. I am deeply committed to the idea that we should not change our electoral system without a referendum to make sure, A, that the people want it, and B, that the system that is being offered to them is actually a system that they want. So a blank check at the front end to do whatever you want, as we saw in the 2015 election, that claim that this is the last election under this system, we're not telling what the new system is not acceptable. But Giving people a choice on two clearly defined policies, one electoral system versus the status quo, very reasonable. I think it's a good idea. But most of all, I like my party's policy, the Conservative policy, on affordability. We want to make sure that most of your money remains in your hands, that you are protected against inflation, you're protected against out-of-control spending or deficits in the future. So please consider voting Conservative on October 21st.
Thank you, Scott Reid, Conservative Party. Stephen Kotze with the Green Party.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure spending this evening with you, and I appreciate you coming out, Brian and Jamie, for organizing this. As you can tell, it's difficult to get everything in. There's a lot to say. There's a lot to talk about. And I think it's really critical that we take the time to listen to each other and that we take the time to look at what we are offering in this election. I think all too often we find at election time various parties offering this, that, and the other, and some of it we have to view a little skeptically, reasonably. I think a good way to assess the reliability of the things that are being promised is to look at how well some of the parties have done in fulfilling the promises that they've made in the past. And I think that that is not a bad place to start. I hope that I've been able to show you a little bit about what the Green Party has to offer. I think that we are a credible party. I think that we have a fully costed, comprehensive platform that really deals with many of the things that are important to you. And I would hope that you can give it a chance. And that I think, I'm hoping that you will seriously consider the Green Party as a good place to place your vote. I think it's very important that we have people in Parliament representing different points of view, and that we force our politicians to work better together to solve the problems that we have instead of fighting with each other. So my name's Stephen Kotze. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the results on October 22nd.
Stephen Kotze from the Green Party. And finally, Kaylee Kennedy from the Liberal Party.
Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce. Also want to give out a shout out to Jackie Kavanaugh, because I believe she had a large role to play in this as well. And Jamie and Brian for moderating. Thank you so much. And also, thank you. It's always a pleasure to sit alongside these folks and have a civil conversation about our visions for making our country a better place. I believe that the Liberal plan is the best way to do so. I've seen over the past 4 years the great work that the Liberal government has been doing and the results it's produced, and I think we need to continue moving forward and not go backwards the Harper years. I believe we need to take climate action, protect women's rights, and also create policies that will benefit the people who need it the most, not those who are already wealthy. Whether it's youth who need skills and opportunities to succeed, seniors who deserve a secure and dignified retirement, or families who depend on the Canada Child Benefit to help their children get the best possible start in life. I will never stop fighting for the people of Lanark-Frontenac-Kingston to ensure that everyone has a real and fair chance at success. On October 21st, or in the advance polls, I hope I can count on your support. I have real dedication and passion to make my community a better place, and I would really appreciate your support. So thank you again so much for your time this evening, for your patience in listening to all of us, and I hope you have a good night.